Hi, welcome to New Abbey. My name's Jess. It's great to have you here today. The scripture verse for this message is Mark 12, 35 through 44. And the question for this week is kind of lighthearted. What is one of your favorite Halloween memories? Take a moment, press pause, and when you're ready, press play and enjoy the message that Darren's going to give us.
So this is a pretty popular story. We have a widow who gives her 2 mites in comparison to all of the religious leaders and wealthy people who are able to throw in tons of money into the temple treasury. And how it's normally interpreted is that this widow has some sort of piety, some sense of commitment and sacrifice to God that we should emulate, right? Well, I want us to think about that, and to help us think about that, what I want to do is tell a little bit of a modern version of this parable. So let's take a step back from the text that we just read, and let's consider a story of a church that is located in downtown LA. Now, this church has people at both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? We have some rich people, we have some poor people, very diverse in that way. And one member of the community happens to be this real estate mogul, this man who has recently purchased some property. Recently purchased a building that he intends to renovate into luxury condos. The problem is that property is low-income housing currently. And so him buying it is essentially going to end the lease for many people in that low-income housing community. Now, also in this church community is a woman who is a single mother, and she lives in that building that this man just bought out and is ending. So we have these 2 members of the same community, and they're both invited to a church, pay what you can dinner party. The real estate mogul, he generously offers to cover the cost of anyone who can't afford to attend the dinner themselves. And the woman, who is stressed because she doesn't have anywhere to go once her lease ends, really desires connection with people, and she needs the support of the community at that dinner party, the people that she doesn't get to see all the time because she is overburdened with a lot of work and with kids. So though she doesn't have the money to do it really, she bites the bullet, she gets some childcare, and she goes to the dinner. And she's able to give $2 to put towards the dinner fund. Now, I tell this story and I give this backdrop, and it'll be very weird for us to say, oh yeah, the lesson from this story is that this woman who gave $2 just to be at a dinner and paid for childcare and sacrificed, even though she barely has anything to her name, we should emulate her sacrifice. Because that's ignoring a very glaring context clue. You see, she was in community with somebody who essentially was exploiting her, right? She did not have the means to have housing for herself that she could afford, and she found herself in a position where she was able to live and work and raise her kids, and now some man in the pursuit of making more money is ending that opportunity for her. So to focus on her piety, her commitment to the community, feels a little weird and missing the point. And I would say that's the same thing that's happening in this story with the widow. So let's go back and look at this story. Let's look at the contours of it and maybe see where this is happening. Because it actually starts with Jesus saying, look at these religious leaders and how they wear their long flowing robes, and they like to be greeted in the marketplace, and they take the seat of honor at banquets, and they're special guests everywhere they go. Look at them, right? And Jesus has a critique for them, but what he says about them first is that, well, they like to devour widows' houses and then give up lengthy prayers. Now that is a damning statement, but what the hell does it mean to devour a widow's house? What's going on here? Well, we've talked a little bit about the economic exploitation that happens back in that time when the temple system offers loans to people, or wealthy elites that are usually connected to the political or religious system offer loans to people that won't be able to keep up their payments for. So eventually, people who got a loan to purchase property default on their loan, and that property ends up becoming the property of the person who gave them a loan. And it was kind of this vicious cycle and institution where the rates for these loans were so high that people weren't able to maintain their own property, and thus a bunch of property and land was amassed among the wealthy elites who were able to give out loans in the first place. Well, let's take that a step further. Is that we have to recognize that women couldn't very easily own property back at this time. So if we're talking about a widow whose husband dies, right, and she doesn't have a son, or the man doesn't have a son, that property has no one to be passed to as an inheritance. And so frequently that property would end up being taken up by the bank or the government or the temple. And you see, in this way, it's very likely that Jesus was referring to this whole system where religious leaders would end up taking the property that widows would live on, leaving them homeless, which goes against the very thing that God commands all over in the law and the prophets: take care of the widow and the foreigner among you. She didn't have a way of surviving well in that patriarchal world. And so God made provision by asking the temple, asking the church, asking the people of God to make sure they cared for the widow and the orphan and the foreigner, because they could not make a way in their own given the system. But there probably is another way that we can talk about this devouring a widow's house. You see, the fact that a widow was coming and putting in her 2 mites, and that meant that there was probably a temple tax. There was an expectation to give some of your money to participate in the temple activities. And the very idea that a woman would have to give over her livelihood, what she needed to eat, in order just to participate in the temple system, whereas people could give 1,000 times more than she could and still be able to eat the finest meal on the planet at the time, that was an unjust system. And you see, what we're seeing here is Jesus is painting the picture of these religious leaders exploiting widows in this first part of this story. And then we get to the part where Jesus watches a widow puts her 2 pieces in. And it shows us that in action. So when Jesus is remarking that she's put in more than all of the rest of them, it's not some sort of we should look at her and we should be her and emulate her. No, that's a lament for a system that did not have a way to include her actual life and allow her to get ahead. This is a passage of lament, not an encouragement towards some sort of piety or pious practice of self-sacrifice. And we have to remember that we don't need to read these passages and always assume that we're supposed to take away and just emulate the people that are a part of it. We have to do a little bit more work than that. That would be the easy way, just to be like, oh yeah, personal piety, great, sacrifice, good, let's move on. But there's a bigger picture, and that's the work we need to do. And that's the work that we have in this world, right? Like, there's a larger context that we all exist within. Every time we say something, it's alluding to something bigger than ourselves and has the backing or the background of some other situation or circumstance that needs to be taken into account for. So when we're looking at this story, we need to be looking at it with the lens of lament, because this is a tragedy. And it's a tragedy dressed up. And here's the other piece. In that one passage where it says they'll devour a widow's house and then offer lengthy prayers, what we're seeing Jesus set up is a duality, a hypocrisy, if you will. That the religious leaders, they would exploit people. They would not do justice. They would find a way to enact laws that made sense in their own religious framework. These religious leaders passed laws that they felt good about religiously that ended up disenfranchising or exploiting the vulnerable. That's the reality of the situation we're in. But they would dress that up. They would dress it up with religiosity. They would dress it up with a grand gesture of prayer and showing people that truly they're a good, religious, God-fearing person. But underneath was this penchant for exploitation. Underneath this person's existence and the way they lived and the way they had their being in the world exploited others, and particularly the widows. Now, there's a lot we could take from this as a community. And I'm guessing if we're here, if you're in this community, you've done some work around religious hypocrisy in the church. You probably have experienced in some way pastors saying or doing one thing, but kind of actualizing another thing in their real life, right? Pastors who maybe don't walk the talk or talk the walk or whatever it might be, right? This is a very common experience for a lot of people these days, and we're experiencing this at a very large scale right now in our political and religious climate. So a lot of us have probably done this work around what it means for a community to hold their leaders responsible and accountable, what it means to hold each other accountable and responsible to each other. We exist in a community where we strive to practice some mutuality, where we strive to care for each other, where we say, if you can't come to the communion table and pay your light bill, then I can't come to the communion table honestly either, right? So we're doing work around this in the community. And because of that, it might be very easy for us to think, well, we've already done this work. I'm not sure what else I have to learn from this passage. I'm not going to be one of these religious hypocrites. I'm going to prioritize justice in my life, and I'm going to see that through in all aspects of my life. But there is an individual call here for us, and I don't want us to miss out on it. Because we love to point at the religious leaders in Jesus' day and call them big hypocrites, but that ignores the reality that we all are in some ways. We all have values, stated values, or ideas, or hopes, or dreams, or a way of being in the world that we would claim, that we would say proudly, that we want to be true. And the reality is we still don't know how to work that out in our actual lives. I don't know how to do justice in my job. I don't know how to be at peace in my family, right? These are values I might have, but I don't know what to do with them in every aspect of my life. And a passage like this is an invitation for us to look honestly at our life and to apply some introspection and some self-reflection about what is it that we say we're passionate about? What is it that we say we value in our hearts and in our minds? And if we say we value that, and I'm looking at my life honestly, am I actually living that out? Am I posting Black Lives Matter loudly and happily, but still too afraid to speak up when I hear someone devaluing a Black life? Right? There's so many ways we can do this with social media, but just in our day-to-day life. And we're not frequently afforded the opportunity, or we at least frequently don't take the opportunity to look at ourselves honestly and say, hey, where am I being a part of this system where we say things that we don't actually do? Where am I contributing, and where am I falling into this very human and natural pattern of saying one thing and doing another? So I want to use this passage as an invitation for self-reflection. No, you may not be exploiting widows out of their housing and saying that you're a religious leader that fights for the justice of God, but maybe there is something in your life that you're looking at right now being like, I've said this for years. I want to be more like this. I want to have more grace for people. I want to learn how to do forgiveness well. I want to know how to study. I don't know, whatever the thing is for you, but you haven't devoted the time or the energy to work that out in your life, or the energy to make the hard decision that you might have to make for that value to be lived out. And I think the justice conversation is really a good place for a lot of us to start. We've been talking about justice. Our world, our church, our country has been talking about racial justice and gender justice for all year, really. And we know how to say the right things, but when it comes down to it, are we attentive of the ways that we treat people of other races, or the ways that we're voting, and think about how that might impact people of other genders or races than us? So what I want us to do is to consider, with everything going on, I cannot tell you what the thing is for you. I cannot tell you what it is that you need to do some introspection on, what the place that you need to grow in integration. That's not something I can do. But what we can do in this space is give just a little time of reflection and set you up. Hopefully, this sermon has kind of given you some pieces to hold on to that have kind of caused you to think about some part of your life. And if not, that's fine. But we're going to take the next 2 minutes in, relative silence, and I want you to consider your life. If you were to state a couple of values in your life, what would they be? You can go through the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, or you can do things like justice or wisdom. Whatever values come to your mind as things that you really want to mark your life by, and you would say that you try to do that. And then look at different aspects of your life. What are you like in your family life? Are you someone who brings joy and peace? What are you like at your work? Do you bring wisdom? Do you bring creativity? Do you bring justice? What are you like when you go to the voting booth? Are you actually voting for peace and justice? We need to bring all parts and all aspects of our life into the conversation if we want to be fully integrated people. So, this is what we're going to do. We're going to be quiet for about 2 minutes. We're going to take 2 minutes to reflect. Reflect on a value, reflect on how that plays out in your life. And then at the end of that 2 minutes, we're going to come back together and we're going to go into our small groups and we're going to ask the question, or answer the question with each other, or chat about what values came up that you want your life to be marked by. And maybe what place do you feel like you need to do the work to integrate that value, right? Do you need to bring joy to your family? Do you need to bring justice to the workplace? Whatever that might be for you. So we're going to start our 2 minutes now, and then we will come back and we'll go into our small groups for a further discussion.
Thank you for joining us. Follow us on Instagram at New Abbey NoHo. And if you're interested in giving to New Abbey NoHo, feel free to head over to www.newabbey.org/generosity. Be sure to scroll down to the North Hollywood Fund. Thank you, and have a blessed week.